After I refused to hand over my share of the family business, my mother called a meeting with lawyers ready to pressure me. But when they laid the papers in front of me, I just smiled and said, "I brought a few guests who have other plans." The room went silent and everything. Hi Reddit, I'm Alex, 42, and I'm here to share a story that's been unraveling in my family for the past year. This isn't some quick, sensational drama. It's a slow burn involving years of manipulation, control, and outright greed, and now it's all coming to a head. To give you some background, our family business is a small chain of hardware stores that my grandparents started back in the 1960s. It's been passed down through the generations, and when my dad died about 10 years ago, ownership went to my mom, Evelyn, my brother Daniel, and me. Mom, Evelyn, is the kind of woman who never takes no for an answer. She's sharp, demanding, and has this uncanny way of twisting any conversation to suit her agenda. She's always been the powerhouse behind the business, but controlling it isn't enough for her. She has to control everyone around her, especially her kids. Daniel, my younger brother by 3 years, has been her favorite for as long as I can remember. He's not particularly skilled or interested in the business. Honestly, he spends most of his time away from the stores, but Mom treats him like the golden son. He's charming when he wants to be, and he's good at playing the role she demands. He's the classic smiling yes man, who never asks too many questions and does what Mom tells him. Me? I've always been more independent. From a young age, I was the one interested in the nuts and bolts of the business. I worked hard, took on responsibility, and even pushed for modernizing things, like introducing better accounting systems and opening up online sales. But none of that sat well with Mom or Daniel. They saw it as rocking the boat and trying to undermine the family legacy. The tension was always there, but it really started to boil over about 2 years ago. Daniel started charging a lot of personal expenses to the company accounts. Trips that had nothing to do with work, dinners with friends, even some luxury items. When I questioned it, Mom brushed it off or said I was overreacting. Whenever I pushed for transparency, she'd get cold and remind me who was really running this business. I tried to be patient, but it became clear that Daniel's behavior was only getting worse, and Mom was enabling it. The last straw came when I discovered some vendor invoices that were suspiciously inflated, and I suspected Daniel was funneling money through fake companies to cover his lifestyle. I brought it up at the board meeting. Mom snapped, accusing me of trying to start drama and dividing the family. Daniel played the victim perfectly, claiming I was jealous and trying to take everything for myself. After that, things between us turned icy. Mom made it clear I wasn't welcome at certain meetings, and Daniel started making decisions without consulting me. I realized that if I didn't stand up now, I'd be pushed out entirely. Last year, I officially asked for an accounting audit and proposed a plan to redistribute some shares to reflect the actual work and investment each of us had put in. Mom refused outright, saying it was disloyal and that the business was a family legacy, not a personal bank account. Daniel backed her up, saying I was being selfish. So I refused to give up my shares or let them be diluted without cause. That's when the real pressure began. Fast forward to last week. I received a formal invitation to a meeting at the company headquarters. When I arrived, the conference room was set up with a long polished table, leather chairs, and that unmistakable scent of expensive coffee and polished wood. Mom was already there, dressed impeccably, with 2 lawyers I'd never met before. Daniel was lounging in a chair, looking far too relaxed for the situation. There was an awkward, forced civility in the air, like everyone was pretending this was a routine business discussion rather than a confrontation that could change everything. Mom started the meeting with her usual calm but firm voice. "Alex, we're here to resolve this matter once and for all. The company needs stability, and it's time for you to accept what's best for the family." One of the lawyers slid a thick folder across the table. "These are the transfer documents for your shares. We ask you to sign today." I looked at the papers carefully. They were designed to strip me of control, handing everything over to Daniel. The fine print was full of legalese about simplification of ownership and avoiding family discord, but everyone there knew it was about Mom and Daniel consolidating power and squeezing me out. I stayed silent for a moment, weighing my words. Then I smiled. Mom's eyes flicked up sharply. "I'm not signing," I said simply. Mom's face tightened. "Alex, you're making a mistake." Before the lawyers could respond, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a stack of printed documents. I hired an independent investigator, I said, voice steady. What I found was disturbing. I laid the evidence on the table. Detailed financial records showing Daniel's unauthorized expenses, shady vendor deals, and clear signs of embezzlement. The two lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel's smile faltered. Mom's composure cracked just slightly. She said, "This is baseless." I shook my head. "Not at all. And I brought a few people who will verify everything." The conference room door opened quietly. Two people stepped in, a forensic accountant from a respected firm and a senior representative from one of our largest suppliers, both holding documents and reports backing up my claims. The room went silent. Mom's face lost its color. Daniel looked as if he wanted to disappear. The senior lawyer cleared his throat, looking between Mom, Daniel, and me. "Given these revelations, we should reconsider the approach here." After that meeting, the atmosphere between my family and me shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated. I thought bringing the evidence to light would force them to back down, or at least give us some kind of chance for an honest discussion. Instead, it was like I had lit a fuse, and now the whole family was gearing up for a fight they were determined to win by any means necessary. The days following the meeting were tense. My phone started ringing more often, calls from unknown numbers, silent hang-ups, even a few messages that felt more like warnings than anything else. At first, I tried to brush it off, focusing on my work and making sure my own life stayed steady. But then things at the company began to deteriorate rapidly. Mom summoned me again, this time with a noticeably colder tone. She said, "You're making this personal, Alex. You think you can come in here with your accusations and threaten the family? This company is a legacy, something you're too short-sighted to understand." Daniel was with her, eyes glittering with something I hadn't seen before, a mix of anger and desperation. It was clear they were scared. The more I pushed, the more they doubled down. Soon enough, the board meetings became battlegrounds. Instead of discussing business plans or strategies, every session turned into a hostile interrogation of me. Mom would interrupt my suggestions with sharp remarks. Daniel started showing up with supporters, longtime employees who seemed loyal to him, but not necessarily qualified or interested in the business's success. They whispered behind my back, spread rumors that I was trying to sabotage the company. They painted me as the troublemaker, the one threatening to destroy what our family had built. But it wasn't just professional sabotage. I started noticing things at home. Mom's subtle digs about my lack of commitment became louder and more public. Family gatherings turned into platforms for her to remind everyone, including distant relatives, how I was disloyal and ungrateful. Daniel would smirk in the background, tossing sly comments my way whenever he thought I wasn't paying attention. My closest friends and even some employees began to pull away, afraid to get caught in the crossfire. The legal pressure escalated too. A week after the meeting with the lawyers, I found a formal letter slipped under my door. It was a cease and desist from the company's legal team, demanding that I stop any further investigations and immediately return any confidential documents I had accessed. They warned of severe legal consequences if I didn't comply. It felt like the family was trying to box me in, suffocate me with rules and threats. But I wasn't about to back down. Then came the real turning point. The moment I realized Mom and Daniel weren't just using legal maneuvers, they were ready to play dirty in every way. One afternoon, a close employee I trusted called me, voice trembling. "Alex, I don't know how to say this, but the company's payroll system was hacked. They're trying to make it look like you're responsible for embezzling funds. There are fake transactions, withdrawals traced back to your accounts." I felt my heart sink. It was a clear setup. I went straight to the company's IT department and hired an independent cybersecurity firm to investigate. The results confirmed my worst fears. Someone inside the company, likely with access to upper management tools, was fabricating evidence to frame me. I thought, this is war. Mom refused to meet me after that. I tried calling, texting, even showed up at her office, but she made it clear I was persona non grata. Meanwhile, Daniel started openly mocking me at public events related to the business. At a supplier conference, he called me the brother who's lost his way, accusing me of jeopardizing the future for personal gain. The crowd looked uncomfortable, but no one stepped in. The local press picked up on the family dispute, but the narrative was skewed heavily in Mom and Daniel's favor. They'd spent years building strong community ties, and they spun the story as if I was the black sheep trying to tear the family apart. One night, I received a message from an anonymous source. It was a video, snippets of private conversations from one of our board meetings, edited to make me look like I was threatening employees and trying to sabotage company operations. The source was clear: sign over your shares, or this goes public. I sat staring at the screen, realizing how far they were willing to go. My own family was orchestrating a smear campaign against me. Instead of giving in, I gathered a small team of loyal employees and outside experts. We began documenting everything: every suspicious email, every unexplained financial movement, every shady conversation. I knew I had to prepare for the worst. The final straw came when my bank contacted me about suspicious activity, multiple large withdrawals flagged as unusual. Someone had apparently tried to freeze my personal accounts and even file a lien against my property. It was clear that Mom and Daniel were trying to ruin me financially, to push me into submission by any means necessary. I realized then that this wasn't just a business dispute. It was personal, a battle for control, pride, and revenge. They saw me as a threat to their empire, and they were ready to destroy me to protect it. But I wasn't alone. The people I brought to that first meeting, the forensic accountant and the supplier's representative, they weren't just witnesses, they became allies. We started planning a counterattack, gathering more evidence, and preparing to expose the truth at the next board meeting. Mom and Daniel didn't know what was coming, and neither did I fully. The morning of the big board meeting arrived slower than usual, as if the whole day was holding its breath. I barely slept the night before. I'd spent hours going over every document, every email, every number, making sure nothing could be twisted against me. My allies, the forensic accountant, Carla, and the supplier's rep, Marcus, were scheduled to arrive early. We agreed to keep the meeting under my control, to not let Mom and Daniel dictate the narrative this time. I walked into the building earlier than usual, and the familiar scent of polished floors and stale coffee hit me like a weight. This place used to feel like home, the core of everything my family and I had built. Now it felt like a cage. Mom was already there, sitting at the head of the long conference table with Daniel on her left. They both looked sharp, of course, dresses and suits impeccable, but the look in their eyes was colder than ever, calculating and impatient. As I entered, Mom's eyes flicked up briefly, then she gave a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Alex," she said, voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Glad you could join us." Daniel barely looked up. "We were wondering if you'd show." The lawyers took their seats, papers shuffled, phones were muted. Carla and Marcus arrived right after me, quietly settling in next to me. I could feel the room tense like a drawn bow. Mom started the meeting with a statement that set the tone. "We're here to discuss the future of the company, a future that requires unity, stability, and trust. Alex has made his position very clear, but his continued resistance is putting us all at risk." She cast a glance at Daniel, who smirked and nodded. I stood slowly, and in my calmest voice said, "Then let's talk about trust, shall we? Because from what I've gathered, trust is the one thing Mom and Daniel seem to have broken repeatedly." There was a flicker of surprise on Mom's face, but she recovered quickly. I pulled out a binder and began laying out the evidence I collected over the past months. I showed the inflated invoices, the fraudulent vendor contracts, the financial transactions Daniel had tried to hide, and the forged documents attempting to frame me for theft. Carla walked the board through the forensic accountant's findings with precise clarity, cutting through the legal jargon and family noise. Marcus presented testimony about how Daniel's actions had directly harmed the supplier relationships and the company's reputation. Mom's calm veneer was slipping. "You're twisting facts," she snapped, but her voice was no longer commanding, more defensive. "These documents were taken out of context. Daniel has always acted in the company's best interests." Daniel leaned forward, voice rising. "This is a smear campaign. Alex is trying to ruin us." I stayed silent, letting their anger fill the room while I calmly added the last piece to the puzzle. A contract signed by Daniel for a vendor that didn't exist, with the payments funneled to an account registered in his name. The room was quiet except for the soft rustle of papers. The lawyers exchanged glances, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. One of the senior board members, an old family friend who'd stayed neutral until now, cleared his throat. "Alex, this is serious. If these allegations are true, Daniel's conduct could be considered fraud. Mom's face paled for a moment, but then she scoffed. Fraud? That's an exaggeration. Daniel made mistakes, nothing more. And as for Alex, his so-called investigation has disrupted the business and damaged morale. I looked around the room, noting who was beginning to doubt Mom's iron grip on the company. That's exactly why I refused to hand over my shares. Because if this keeps happening, the company won't last another year. And that will be on Mom and Daniel's heads. Mom's expression twisted with fury, and Daniel suddenly slammed his fist on the table. You think you're some hero? You're just a greedy opportunist trying to steal what isn't yours. At that moment, Carla stepped forward with something else. We also found evidence of efforts to intimidate and threaten employees to silence any dissent. Heads turned sharply toward Daniel, whose smirk had vanished. I revealed emails and messages between Daniel and several key employees, pressuring them to support his version of events or risk losing their jobs. One by one, board members shifted in their seats. The facade Mom and Daniel had maintained for decades was cracking, but I wasn't done yet. I pulled out a final document, a letter from the bank outlining suspicious activity tied to Daniel, including attempts to freeze my personal accounts and liens filed without justification. You tried to ruin me financially, I said, voice steady. That's illegal. And now, it's on record. Mom's voice dropped to a whisper. You don't know what you're doing. I smiled. On the contrary, I do. And I brought a few guests who have other plans. At that moment, two more people entered the room, the bank's legal counsel and a representative from the regulatory body overseeing financial compliance. The room fell silent again. The bank's counsel laid out the irregularities in detail, explaining that a full investigation was underway. The compliance rep added that such actions could result in criminal charges. Mom's face was pale, lips pressed thin. Daniel looked like he might bolt. Then came the most satisfying moment, the final blow. I stood and said, I refuse to let this family business be destroyed by greed and corruption. I am here to protect its legacy, even if that means taking every step necessary. The room stayed quiet, the weight of what had just been revealed hanging heavy. But then, without warning, Mom's expression shifted from shock to something darker, a cold, almost predatory look. She said, You may have won this round, Alex, but you've just declared war, and I don't lose. Daniel nodded, voice low but deadly. This isn't over. After that intense board meeting, things spiraled quickly. Mom and Daniel tried every tactic they could muster, threats, legal maneuvers, even attempts to manipulate some of the smaller shareholders. But the tide had turned. With the evidence firmly in hand and the bank and regulatory bodies now watching closely, their position was no longer unshakable. The first blow came within weeks. The Financial Regulatory Agency launched a formal investigation into Daniel's actions, freezing his access to company accounts and suspending his role on the board pending the outcome. That same day, Mom's closest allies in the company started quietly distancing themselves. The whispers of her involvement in covering for Daniel's fraud began to circulate, and shareholders grew restless. Meanwhile, I worked closely with Carla and Marcus to restructure the company's leadership. We introduced stricter oversight measures and transparent accounting practices. Morale among employees, which had been plummeting under Daniel's bullying, began to improve. Mom's attempts to intimidate me at home or outside business hours became less frequent, replaced by icy silences and avoidance. Family gatherings became a battlefield of passive-aggressive comments and barely concealed resentment. Daniel, stripped of power and publicly disgraced, spiraled into bitterness. He tried to rally supporters for a hostile takeover, but the legal bindings and his damaged reputation made that impossible. Eventually, the company's shareholders voted to buy out Mom and Daniel's shares. They reluctantly agreed, knowing the writing was on the wall. The family business, once a symbol of their control, was now under a new era, one built on integrity, accountability, and respect. As for Mom and Daniel, their reputations in the community were irreparably damaged. The local press reported on the scandal extensively, making clear the roles they played in jeopardizing the business for personal greed. Invitations to community events stopped arriving. Even distant relatives began to quietly sever ties. Personally, I felt a complicated mix of relief and sadness. This was never how I wanted things to end, but after years of manipulation and betrayal, there was no room left for forgiveness. I kept my shares and took on a leadership role, determined to rebuild the company into something truly worthy of the family name, a legacy of hard work, honesty, and fairness. The day I officially took the helm, I looked out over the office filled with employees who had stood by me through everything. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that, despite everything, I had prevailed not through ruthlessness but through perseverance and truth. Mom and Daniel's attempts to pressure and control me had only made me stronger. The family business was mine to protect now, and I wasn't going to let anyone ruin it again. So, that's where things stand. The battle is over, but the scars remain. Sometimes, I still get messages from former allies of Mom and Daniel, bitter and angry. But I've learned to keep my focus on the future and on building something better from the ashes of their betrayal. If there's one thing this whole ordeal taught me, it's this. No matter how deep the betrayal or how high the stakes, standing firm on what's right will always be worth it. And sometimes, the most important victory isn't just winning the fight. It's proving you're nothing like the villains who tried to take everything from you. Thanks for reading. If you're dealing with toxic family or business battles, know you're not alone. And sometimes the hardest fights bring the clearest victories. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. The first time my father said it out loud, everyone laughed. That should have been my warning sign. We were sitting around my aunt's dining table, the kind that only comes out for holidays or important family dinners, the kind that's supposed to make you feel like you belong just by sitting there. Plates were half empty, wine glasses half full, and the conversation had drifted into that familiar territory where people start telling stories about each other instead of talking to each other. I was 34 at the time. My name's Henry, old enough to know when something is off, young enough to still hope it isn't. My father leaned back in his chair, smiling, that relaxed grin he always wore when he thought he was being charming. He waved his fork toward me like he was pointing out a funny detail in the room. "You know Henry," he said, chuckling. "He's the one we warn people about." There was a split second where the room went quiet, just long enough for the words to land. Then the laughter came. Not everyone, but enough. My mother smiled tightly. My older sister let out a sharp laugh and shook her head like this was a long-running joke I'd somehow missed. Someone said, "Oh, stop," but they were still smiling. I smiled too. That's the part that still bothers me the most. I'd grown up being the difficult one, at least according to my family. Not loud, not rude, not reckless, just inconvenient. I asked questions when everyone else nodded. I didn't go along with plans just to keep the peace. I noticed things. When money disappeared, when promises shifted, when stories changed depending on who was listening. That made me a problem. My sister was the golden child. She followed the script. Same college my parents approved of, same kind of career they could brag about, same polite distance from anything that might rock the boat. My father adored that about her. She made him look good without ever challenging him. I didn't. From the time I was a teenager, there was this quiet narrative that followed me around like a shadow. Henry's smart, but he's stubborn. Henry's capable, but he doesn't know how to play the game. Henry's intense. Henry overthinks things. Henry can't just let stuff go. By the time I was in my 20s, that had evolved into something sharper. Henry's hard to work with. Henry's not a team player. Henry's the kind of guy you have to be careful around. So when my father said, "You're the one we warn people about," it wasn't new. It was just the first time he'd said it like a punchline. I took a sip of water, nodded, and said something self-deprecating to keep the moment moving. That's what I'd learned to do. If you lean into it, it hurts less. If you laugh first, no one can accuse you of being sensitive. But inside, something shifted. Because this wasn't just a random comment. It was said with confidence. Like he knew everyone at that table would agree with him. Like my role in the family had been decided a long time ago. And tonight he was just reminding everyone where I stood. After dinner, my aunt pulled me aside and said, "You know how your father is. He doesn't mean it." My mother told me later that night that I should try not to take things so personally. My sister texted me a laughing emoji and said, "You really do give off intense vibes sometimes." No one asked if I was okay. What they didn't see, and what I didn't tell them, was that I'd spent the last 10 years quietly building a life that had almost nothing to do with them. I didn't talk about my work much at family gatherings, partly because they never asked, partly because every time I did, it somehow turned into a lecture or a joke. My father especially had a way of turning any success of mine into a lesson about how much easier things would be if I just listened to him more. He loved to talk about his company, not just work there. His company, a mid-sized operation he'd been with since before I was born. He didn't own it, at least not on paper, but if you listened to him talk, you'd think his name was on the building. He told stories about staying late, about sacrifices, about how nothing would run without him. He spoke about the owner like an inconvenience and about the employees like children who needed guidance. At every family event, there was some version of the same story. When I retire, I don't know how they'll manage. They'd be lost without me. I built that place from the ground up. Sometimes he'd look right at me when he said it, like he was daring me to challenge him. I didn't. Not then. The thing about being labeled the one we warn people about is that eventually, people stop being surprised when you go quiet. They assume you're sulking or plotting or being dramatic. They don't consider that you might be paying attention. And I was paying attention to the way my father talked about loyalty when it benefited him and dismissed it when it didn't. To the way he laughed off my concerns but took my sister's opinions seriously. To the way he assumed I was always on the outside of things that mattered. Over the next few months, the jokes didn't stop. If anything, they got more comfortable. My father would introduce me to distant relatives with a grin and say, "Careful with this one." He'd tell stories about my childhood that made me sound unreasonable or unstable, always ending them with a laugh and a shrug. That's just Henry. I kept smiling. I kept showing up. I kept letting him talk. Because somewhere between that dinner and the next, I realized something important. He thought he knew me. He thought he had me figured out. He thought I was predictable. And that confidence made him sloppy. The real turning point didn't come with a big argument or a dramatic scene. It came quietly, in the form of an invitation he never expected me to see. A calendar notification forwarded to the wrong email thread. A meeting he assumed I'd never be part of. It had his company's name in the subject line. I stared at it longer than I probably should have, my stomach tightening, my mind already racing ahead. This wasn't just any meeting. The wording was careful, formal, strategic. The kind of meeting where decisions get made that don't get undone easily. And my father was listed as a key attendee. I didn't reply. I didn't say anything to anyone. I just closed my laptop and sat there, thinking about that dinner, about the laughter, about the way he'd said my name like a warning label. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if the person everyone underestimated finally stopped playing along. That meeting was coming. And whether my father realized it or not, the story he'd been telling about me for years was about to collide with a version of me he'd never bothered to know. For a while after that email, nothing exploded. That was almost worse. Life kept moving in that slow, grinding way where you're never sure if you're waiting for something to happen or if you're just imagining the tension because you're tired. Family dinners continued. Phone calls happened. My father kept telling his stories. And every time he did, the tone shifted just a little more. The jokes sharpened. The pauses got longer. The glances toward me became more deliberate. It started with small things. My sister announced she'd been informally promised a senior role at her firm. My parents threw her a dinner to celebrate, complete with a cake and a toast about how proud they were of her focus and reliability. I was invited, of course, but it was framed like a courtesy. "We know you're busy," my mother said. "We didn't want to pressure you." At the dinner, my father raised his glass and said, "This is what happens when you listen, when you don't fight every system you come across." He didn't say my name, but he didn't have to. His eyes flicked to me, then away, like he'd just made his point and was done with it. I nodded and clapped with everyone else. Inside, something tightened again. Not anger, not yet. More like clarity. A few weeks later, my mother called me with a favor. Or what she called a favor. She needed help reviewing some documents related to my father's retirement planning. "You're good with this kind of stuff," she said, her voice careful. "And your father doesn't really have the patience." I agreed. Not because I wanted to help him, but because I wanted to see the documents. They were revealing. Not in the dramatic sense. Just quietly, disturbingly revealing. There was a lot of assumption baked into them. Assumption that my father's role was irreplaceable. Assumption that the company would continue to operate around him even after he stepped back. Assumption that his word carried more weight than it legally did. I asked a few neutral questions. My father waved them off. "You're overthinking it, Henry," he said. "This stuff is handled. You wouldn't understand how it works at that level." I almost laughed at that. That night, I went back to my own notes, my own files, my own contacts. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't confront anyone. I just started connecting dots I'd been keeping separate for years. The email, the meeting, the way my father talked about ownership without ever actually saying he owned anything. The next family gathering was where things shifted from subtle to unmistakable. It was my parents' anniversary dinner. Big guest list. Extended family. Old friends. One of those events where everyone dresses slightly nicer than usual and pretends old tensions don't exist. I arrived on time, brought a gift, made small talk. I was halfway through a conversation with a cousin when I heard my father's voice rise from across the room. He means well, my father was saying, laughing, but you know Henry. Always suspicious. Always thinks there's something going on. Someone asked, about what? Oh, everything, he replied. Business, family life. He's the kind of guy who assumes the worst and then acts surprised when people don't want him involved. This time, more people laughed. I felt it then. Not embarrassment. Not even anger. Just the clean, cold realization that this wasn't accidental anymore. This wasn't awkward humor. This was reputation management. He was shaping how people saw me, on purpose, so that if I ever spoke up, it would already sound unreasonable. I excused myself and stepped outside, stood in the cool air, and stared at my phone. I thought about leaving. I thought about confronting him. I thought about staying silent like I always did. What stopped me was the memory of my father's face when he talked about that company. The certainty, the entitlement, the way he said, mine, without ever saying it out loud. I went back inside. Later that evening, after dessert, my father tapped his glass for attention. I just want to say, he began, that family is everything. And loyalty matters. Especially when you've given decades of your life to something. To people. He looked around the table, then at me. Not everyone understands that, he continued. Some people think everything is transactional. That relationships are just leverage. Those are the people you have to be careful with. This time, no one laughed immediately. There was a pause. A few uncomfortable shifts in chairs. My mother reached for her wine glass. My sister stared at her plate. I felt every eye in the room flick toward me. I smiled. Again. But it felt different. Controlled. Measured. I agree, I said calmly. Loyalty does matter. My father nodded, satisfied, like he'd just won something. After the dinner, my sister cornered me near the coat rack. Why do you let him do that? She asked quietly. You know he doesn't mean it like that. I looked at her and realized something else. She believed that. Or at least needed to. He means it exactly how he says it, I replied. He's just used to no one pushing back. She frowned. You're reading too much into it. Maybe. Or maybe I was finally reading it clearly. The breaking point didn't come at a dinner, though. It came a few weeks later, in a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear about. My mother called me upset. Not angry. Upset in that fragile, confused way that makes you listen closely. She said my father had been stressed lately, that there were changes happening at work, that he felt threatened. I asked what she meant. She hesitated, then said, he thinks you're trying to interfere. He told someone you were asking questions you shouldn't be asking. I felt my chest tighten. Who did he tell? She named someone. Someone I recognized immediately. Someone tied directly to that meeting. My father had gone out of his way to frame me as a risk. Not just to family. Not just socially. Professionally. I asked my mother what exactly he'd said. She sighed. He told them you have a history of causing problems. That you don't respect boundaries. That you're unpredictable. I closed my eyes. There it was. The betrayal. Clean and undeniable. This wasn't teasing. This wasn't ego. This was him actively protecting his position by undermining me. Preemptively. Quietly. Confident that I'd never find out, or if I did, that I wouldn't do anything about it. I thanked my mother for telling me. She sounded relieved, like she'd been carrying something she didn't understand. After the call, I sat in my apartment for a long time without moving. I replayed every comment, every joke, every warning he'd ever made about me. I saw the pattern now. The slow conditioning. The way he'd trained everyone to doubt me before I ever opened my mouth. And the thing that hurt the most wasn't the professional sabotage. It was the certainty behind it. He didn't think I deserved a chance to speak for myself. He didn't think I was worth taking seriously. He thought the story he'd told about me was permanent. That night, I opened my laptop and pulled up that meeting invite again. The one I'd never acknowledged. The one he thought I'd never attend. For the first time, I didn't just read it. I accepted it. And as the confirmation hit my inbox, I realized this wasn't about defending myself anymore. This was about something far bigger. Something that, once set in motion, couldn't be undone. My father had spent decades calling something his. He had no idea how close he was to finding out what ownership actually looked like. The night after I accepted that meeting invite, I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel clever or vindicated. I felt hollow. People always imagine moments like that as turning points where everything snaps into focus and you suddenly become decisive. That wasn't it. It felt more like standing at the edge of something deep and realizing, very calmly, that you were already falling. Because once I accepted that invite, there was no pretending anymore. No telling myself that my father's behavior was clumsy or misunderstood or exaggerated in my head. He had crossed a line, and worse, he had done it confidently, assuming I was too small, too passive, too difficult to matter. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. The next few weeks were rough in ways I didn't expect. Not dramatic explosions, just quiet losses stacking on top of each other. My father stopped calling entirely. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then I realized he was doing it deliberately, pulling back in that way people do when they want to regain control. Silence is punishment. My mother's calls became shorter, more cautious. She stopped sharing details about his work or their plans, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. My sister distanced herself too. Not overtly. She still replied to messages, still sent polite check-ins, but the warmth was gone. I could feel her choosing a side without ever saying it out loud. At work, things tightened. Conversations became more formal. People I'd spoken to casually for years started looping others into emails that used to be just between us. I wasn't pushed out, not exactly, but I could feel the air changing. Like someone had opened a window and the temperature dropped. And I knew where it was coming from. My father hadn't just warned people about me once. He'd been doing it steadily, carefully, over time, painting me as unpredictable, combative, unsafe. So when he felt threatened, he didn't panic. He escalated. There were days I genuinely wondered if I'd miscalculated. If maybe I should have kept my head down. Let him have his stories. Let him retire on his terms. Let the family narrative stay intact. Then I'd remember his voice, laughing at that dinner. You're the one we warn people about. And the doubt hardened into resolve. Still, resolve doesn't pay the bills or soothe your nerves at 3 in the morning. There was a stretch there where I didn't sleep well at all. I'd lie awake replaying conversations, wondering how much damage had already been done behind my back. Wondering who believed him. Wondering who would side with him if things turned ugly. That was the lowest point. Not when something bad happened, but when nothing did, and I was left alone with the uncertainty. I stopped going to family dinners altogether. I didn't announce it. I just declined politely. Busy that night. Out of town. Not feeling great. No one pushed back. That hurt more than I expected. With the distance came quiet. And in that quiet, something else surfaced. I started writing things down. Not emotionally. Practically. Timelines. Conversations. Emails. Names. Dates. I wasn't plotting revenge yet. I wasn't even sure what the endgame looked like. I just knew I needed clarity. Facts. Something solid in a situation that felt slippery and distorted. I reached out to people I trusted. Carefully. One conversation at a time. I didn't lead with accusations. I asked questions. Neutral ones. Curious ones. The kind that don't trigger defenses. And slowly, a picture formed. My father's influence was real, but narrower than he believed. He was respected, yes, but not untouchable. Trusted, but not blindly. There were frustrations with him I hadn't known about. Complaints whispered but never addressed. Concerns about succession. About stagnation. About his inability to adapt. He'd mistaken longevity for ownership. Authority for control. That distinction mattered more than he realized. At the same time, I started rebuilding parts of my life I'd neglected while trying to maintain some version of family peace. I reconnected with colleagues I'd drifted from. Took on projects that reminded me why people had trusted me in the first place. I didn't talk about my father. I didn't frame myself as wronged. I just showed up, consistent and prepared. It felt strange at first, asserting myself without apology. Like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit yet. But the more I did it, the steadier I felt. One evening, a former mentor invited me for coffee. We hadn't spoken in years. After some catching up, he leaned back and said, I heard some odd things about you recently. My chest tightened. From who? He didn't name my father directly, but he didn't have to. I didn't recognize the person they were describing, he continued. So, I wanted to hear it from you. I told him the truth. Not the emotional version. The factual one. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly. That makes more sense. That moment mattered more than I realized at the time. It reminded me that reputations aren't owned by the loudest voice. They're shaped by consistency, by receipts, by how you show up when no one's watching. The meeting crept closer. I prepared obsessively, not because I was nervous about speaking, but because I didn't want to rely on emotion. I didn't want to be the difficult one, walking into a room full of decision makers. I wanted to be the most informed person there. Meanwhile, my father's behavior escalated in quieter ways. I heard from a cousin that he'd referred to me as unstable during a conversation about business. From an old family friend that he'd suggested I was going through something personal and shouldn't be taken too seriously. It was character assassination, dressed up as concern. And still, no one confronted me directly. That was another low point. Knowing someone was actively dismantling your credibility while smiling to your face, or worse, pretending you didn't exist. The day before the meeting, my mother finally called. Her voice was tight. Your father says you're attending something tomorrow. Yes, I replied. There was a pause. He's confused. He doesn't understand why you'd be there. I'm sure he doesn't. She sighed. Henry, do you really want to do this? It's going to cause problems. That word again. Problems. As if they hadn't already been caused. I didn't create this situation, I said gently. I'm just responding to it. She didn't argue. That scared me more than if she had. That night, I didn't sleep much, but not from anxiety. From focus. The kind that sharpens you, grounds you. I wasn't fantasizing about outcomes anymore. I wasn't imagining dramatic reveals or confrontations. I was thinking about alignment, about leverage, about timing, and I realized something that surprised me. Even if this meeting went badly, even if my father tried to block me, I wasn't the same person I'd been at that dinner months ago. The one who smiled automatically. The one who swallowed discomfort to keep the peace. I'd lost something in the process. The illusion of family unity. The comfort of belonging without conditions. But I'd gained something too. Perspective. Independence. A sense of self that wasn't filtered through my father's approval or my sister's comparison or my mother's quiet mediation. The morning of the meeting, I looked at myself in the mirror longer than usual. Not checking my appearance. Checking my posture. My expression. Making sure I wasn't carrying old fear into a room that demanded calm. As I grabbed my keys, my phone buzzed with a message from my sister. Dad's really upset. He thinks you're doing this to embarrass him. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. I'm not doing this to him, I wrote. I'm doing this because of him. I put the phone away and walked out the door. By the time I reached the building where the meeting was being held, my hands were steady. My breathing was slow. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt ready. And somewhere inside that building, my father was still telling his version of the story. Still confident. Still laughing. Still assuming I'd play the role he'd assigned me. He didn't know it yet, but the ground he'd been standing on for 30 years was already shifting. And once it started moving, there would be no stopping it. By the time I walked into that meeting room, I understood something I hadn't before. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just sits there quietly, waiting to be recognized. The room itself was unremarkable. Neutral walls, long table, glass pitcher of water no one touched. A handful of people already seated, some checking phones, some flipping through printed agendas. Conversations were low, professional, restrained. This wasn't a battlefield. It was an operating room. My father was already there. He didn't see me at first. He was leaning toward one of the board members, speaking with that familiar confidence, gesturing casually like he owned the space. His posture was relaxed, comfortable. This was his environment. He'd been walking into rooms like this for decades, telling himself he belonged there more than anyone else. When he finally noticed me, the change was subtle but unmistakable. His smile faltered, just a fraction of a second. His eyebrows lifted, then tightened. Confusion first, then irritation, then something else, something closer to offense. He straightened in his chair. I didn't acknowledge him immediately. I took a seat across the table, nodded politely to the others, and opened my folder. I could feel his attention on me like pressure, but I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was happening in his head. Why is he here? Who invited him? What does he think he's doing? The meeting began. Introductions, formalities, updates. My father spoke early, confidently, steering the conversation the way he always did. He referenced past successes, emphasized stability, framed change as risk. It was the same pitch I'd heard him deliver at family dinners, just with more polished language. When it was my turn to speak, the room shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. I kept it short, concise, focused. I didn't contradict my father outright. I didn't challenge his authority. I simply asked questions, clarifying ones, strategic ones, questions that reframed the conversation without raising alarms. I watched as people leaned forward slightly, as notes were taken, as someone asked me to expand on a point instead of turning back to my father. He noticed too. By the end of the meeting, nothing explosive had happened. No confrontation, no reveal. But the air felt different, charged, unsettled. As people packed up, one of the board members approached me quietly. "I wasn't aware you were involved at this level," he said. "I don't advertise," I replied. He smiled. "We should talk." My father waited until we were alone. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. I met his eyes calmly. "I was invited." "By who?" "You'd have to ask them." His jaw tightened. "You had no right." "I have every right," I said evenly. "You just never considered that I might use it." For a moment, I thought he might explode. Instead, he did something worse. He laughed. "Don't embarrass yourself," he said quietly. "You don't understand how this works." I smiled back, politely. "I understand exactly how this works." And then I walked away. That was the moment he realized he'd misjudged me. Not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle him. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly, but never recklessly. I didn't push. I positioned. I followed up with the people who wanted to talk. I listened more than I spoke. I asked what they wanted for the company's future, not what they thought about my father. The answers were revealing. There was frustration, fatigue, a sense that the company had stalled, held in place by tradition and ego. People respected my father's history, but they were tired of being governed by it. And slowly, without ever saying it out loud, they began to look at me differently. Not as his son, as an option. At the same time, my father's behavior began to crack. He became defensive, short-tempered. He started calling meetings that didn't go anywhere, insisting on updates no one had asked for. He pushed back against ideas he'd previously ignored. He spoke louder, longer, trying to reassert dominance through presence. At home, it was worse. My mother called me almost daily, her voice strained. "He doesn't understand why this is happening," she said once. "He feels blindsided." I almost told her the truth, that he wasn't blindsided. He was just finally facing consequences for a narrative he'd written without my consent. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I kept building. I reviewed financials, governance structures, share distributions, voting thresholds, everything my father had waved away for years as handled. The deeper I went, the clearer it became how much of his authority rested on assumption rather than reality. He wasn't the pillar he thought he was. He was a fixture, and fixtures can be replaced. One evening, I received a message from someone I didn't expect, a senior manager who'd been loyal to my father for years. "I think it's time we talk," it read. We met discreetly. No dramatics, just honesty. "He doesn't see what's coming," the manager said after a while, "and he's going to fight it badly." "I'm not trying to humiliate him," I replied. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." That was when I understood the difference between revenge and inevitability. I wasn't plotting a takedown. I was aligning with reality. And reality was no longer on my father's side. At the next family dinner, the tension was unbearable. My father barely spoke to me. When he did, it was curt, dismissive. He told stories louder than usual, trying to reclaim the room. No one laughed as easily this time. At one point, he leaned toward a relative and said, "Some people mistake access for authority." I met his gaze across the table and said nothing. After dinner, my sister pulled me aside, her face pale. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "He's scared." I studied her for a moment. "He taught me how to survive in rooms like this," I said. "He just never expected me to use the lessons." She didn't reply. The final piece fell into place quietly, almost anticlimactically. A document. A vote. A procedural detail my father had ignored because it didn't suit his story. When I realized what it meant, I sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly. This wasn't about proving him wrong anymore. This was about deciding how far to go. I looked at my calendar. Another meeting was scheduled, Bigger this time. Final in ways the last one hadn't been. My father was listed as attending. So was I? And this time, the outcome wouldn't depend on who spoke the loudest. It would depend on who had prepared for the truth. I closed my laptop and stared out the window, thinking about that dinner months ago. About the laughter. About the warning label he'd slapped on me like a joke. He'd been right about one thing. People should have been warned. Just not about me. The final meeting took place on a Thursday morning. I remember that detail because my father always said Thursdays were bad for big decisions. Too close to the weekend, he claimed. People get sloppy. Emotional. He used to say it like wisdom. The irony didn't escape me as I walked into the room. This time, he saw me immediately. No confusion now. No disbelief. Just a tight expression he tried and failed to mask. He nodded once, curtly, the way you acknowledge an inconvenience you can't remove. The room was fuller than before. Legal counsel, senior leadership, board members who didn't usually bother with routine discussions. This wasn't an update meeting. This was a decision meeting. My father launched in early, as expected. He spoke about legacy, about continuity, about the danger of destabilizing something that had worked for decades. He framed himself as the steady hand, the guardian of culture, the only one who truly understood the company's DNA. He didn't mention me by name. Not once. When he finished, the chair thanked him and turned to the agenda. One item remained. The one my father had never taken seriously because he'd assumed the outcome was already decided. Governance restructuring. The chair looked at me. Henry, would you like to walk us through your proposal? My father's head snapped toward me. I stood calmly. No theatrics. No speeches. Just facts. I explained the ownership structure, the voting rights, the succession clauses my father had ignored because they didn't align with his self-image. I laid out the numbers, the stagnation, the opportunities that had been deferred because they threatened existing power dynamics. I didn't accuse. I didn't insult. I didn't even mention my father directly. I let the truth do the work. When questions came, I answered them precisely. When objections arose, I acknowledged them and addressed them. I didn't rush. I didn't overreach. And then came the vote. My father sat very still. His hands were folded tightly on the table. For the first time in my life, he wasn't controlling the room. The motion passed. Not narrowly. Decisively. The restructuring triggered a buyout clause. One that had existed for years. One my father had dismissed as theoretical. It required the company to formally separate operational leadership from legacy advisory roles. In plain terms, it meant this. He was no longer in charge. He could remain as a consultant, an advisor, a ceremonial presence. But the authority he'd treated as ownership for 30 years was gone. The room was quiet afterward. Not awkward. Respectful. Heavy. My father stood abruptly. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice sharper than he probably intended. "You're letting ambition override experience." The chair met his gaze calmly. "We're letting reality guide our future." My father looked at me then. Really looked at me. Not as a problem. Not as a joke. As a threat he'd underestimated. "You planned this," he said. I shook my head. "You did." He left without another word. The fallout didn't explode the way I'd once imagined. It unfolded slowly, painfully, in ripples. My father told people he'd been betrayed. That politics had won. That his own son had turned against him. Some believed him. Many didn't. The difference now was that his version of events no longer carried authority by default. At home, the shift was seismic. My mother oscillated between anger and grief. "You humiliated him," she said one night, tears in her eyes. "I didn't," I replied gently. "I stopped protecting him from consequences." My sister didn't speak to me for weeks. When she finally did, her voice was subdued. "He doesn't know who he is anymore," she said. I thought about that. About how much of his identity had been built on dominance, on being untouchable, on defining others before they could define themselves. "I know," I said. "He never wanted anyone else to be." The hardest moment came later, unexpectedly. I ran into my father at a quiet cafe near his house. He looked older, smaller, not defeated, but diminished in a way I'd never seen before. He didn't sit down, just stood there, hands in his pockets. "You always wanted to prove something," he said. "No," I replied. "I wanted you to stop lying about me." He scoffed. "You could have come to me." I met his eyes. "I did. For years." "You laughed." He didn't have a response to that. He left without another word. Over time, the company stabilized. Then it grew. Slowly at first. Then with confidence, people stopped whispering and started building. The culture shifted. The fear eased. As for me, I didn't take his old role. I didn't need to. I took responsibility, not dominance. I made space instead of filling it. At the next family gathering, months later, the atmosphere was different. Quieter. More cautious. No jokes at my expense. No warnings disguised as laughter. An aunt pulled me aside and said, "Your father always said you were trouble." I smiled faintly. I guess he was right. She laughed, uncertainly, then stopped. I went home that night and thought about that dinner months ago. About the first time he'd said it out loud. "You're the one we warn people about." He'd meant it as a joke. A dismissal. A way to keep me small. He never realized warnings cut both ways. Some people warn you about storms. Others are the storm. And sometimes, the person everyone warned them about is the only one honest enough to change the weather. My name's Tyler, I'm 26, and I've always been the quiet one in the family. The one who doesn't argue, doesn't talk back, just nods and keeps the peace while everyone else raises their voices. Growing up, I learned early that silence was safer, especially when you're dealing with people like my dad. He was the kind of man who saw obedience as respect and anything less as rebellion. And my mom, she just followed his lead, even when it hurt me. But this story really begins a few months ago, right after I landed my first stable job as an accountant for a mid-sized logistics firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. I was proud. After years of struggling through school, paying off debts, and working part-time shifts wherever I could, I finally felt like I had control over my life. For once, the paycheck was mine. At least, that's what I thought. When I told my parents I'd gotten the job, my dad clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good. Now you can start giving back." I thought he meant small things, helping out with groceries or taking them to dinner once in a while. I didn't realize he meant everything. See, my older sister, Haley, had just had a baby. Her boyfriend left as soon as she announced she was pregnant, and since then, she's been living back home with our parents. I felt bad for her, genuinely. She was only 28, but she looked tired all the time, not just from motherhood, but from the way she'd settled into this endless loop of depending on everyone else to clean up her messes. My parents doted on her like she was made of glass. They did her laundry, cooked her meals, took turns babysitting, and never once told her no. Meanwhile, every time I came over, I'd hear some version of, "Haley's been through a lot. Be understanding, Tyler." At first I brought over baby supplies when I could, lent her money for formula once or twice, and even helped set up a small savings account for her kid. But as soon as I got that steady paycheck, something changed in how my dad looked at me. Like I was no longer his son, just a walking wallet. It started one Saturday morning when I stopped by their house. The baby was crying somewhere in the background, my mom was making coffee, and my dad was reading the paper. Without looking up, he said, "We need to talk about your finances." That sentence made me freeze. "My finances?" I asked, half laughing because it sounded absurd. "Yeah," he said, folding the newspaper carefully and setting it aside. "You're earning now, and this family's been through a lot. It's time you start contributing properly." I thought he meant maybe rent money for Haley or some household support. So I asked, "How much are we talking about?" My mom looked at my dad nervously, like she didn't agree but didn't dare say it. My dad's tone hardened. "Your paycheck belongs to the family now, Tyler. Especially Haley. She's raising a baby, and that's not cheap." I stared at him, completely thrown. "Wait, you're saying my whole paycheck?" He frowned, like I was being ungrateful. "Of course not all of it. You can keep enough for your bus fare and lunch. The rest will go through us, so we can make sure it's used responsibly. That's what families do." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was insane. "Dad, I've got rent, bills, my own expenses." He cut me off sharply. "You're not special. Everyone sacrifices for family. We helped you through school, didn't we? It's time to return the favor." That hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth to speak, but my mom jumped in softly, trying to smooth things over. "Your father just means it's your turn to support Haley for a while. She needs help, Tyler. You're doing well now, and she's struggling." Haley walked into the kitchen at that exact moment, baby on her hip, wearing one of those smug little smiles that said she already knew about this conversation. "Dad told me you'd understand," she said. "Thank you for helping out. It really means a lot." That's when I realized it wasn't a discussion. They'd already decided for me. I didn't argue that day. I just stood there, heart pounding, and muttered, "Yeah, sure," because I knew arguing wouldn't get me anywhere. I left shortly after, saying I had work to do, and drove home in silence. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream. But years of being raised under my dad's thumb had taught me to swallow my anger until it turned into something quieter, something sharper. Over the next few weeks, things escalated fast. My dad started calling every few days to ask when I was sending money. Haley texted me her budget breakdowns, diapers, formula, new clothes, and somehow always a few miscellaneous expenses that never made sense. When I hesitated, my dad would remind me of all they'd done for me. "We didn't have to pay your tuition," he'd say. "We could have let you struggle." And the guilt worked, for a while. I started transferring small amounts, telling myself it was temporary. But temporary turned into expected. Every payday they'd ask. Every delay, they'd guilt trip. And Haley, she started acting like it was her right. She once called me just to say, "Hey, can you send it today instead of Friday? I want to take mom and dad out for lunch as a thank you." That made my blood boil. My money being used to celebrate them for manipulating me. I tried to talk to them again, calmly, explaining that I couldn't keep doing this. I told them I needed to save for my own place, that I was trying to build a future. My dad didn't even let me finish. "Your future doesn't matter if your family's suffering," he said. "You're being selfish." That night, I sat alone in my apartment and thought about everything I'd been through. All the years I'd spent trying to earn their respect, their approval, their love. And for what? To be treated like an ATM. I decided I wasn't going to give in anymore. But I also knew I couldn't just confront them. Not yet. They'd twist it, make me the villain, and somehow convince everyone I'd abandoned my family. So instead, I went quiet. I told them my job had cut hours and stopped sending money altogether. Haley whined. My dad lectured. My mom pleaded. I just kept my answers short and neutral. Then something happened that changed everything. Something I didn't expect. My grandfather, my dad's father, called me one evening out of the blue. He's old school, the kind of man who doesn't waste words, so when he called, I assumed it was something serious. "Tyler," he said, voice gruff but warm. "I heard there's some trouble in the family. Your father's been talking." My stomach twisted. "What kind of trouble?" He paused for a long moment, then said, "He's been telling everyone you're refusing to help your sister, that you've become selfish since you started working." I felt that familiar anger rise up again. "That's not true. He stopped me gently. "I know, son. I know your father. I just wanted to hear your side." So I told him everything. How my parents had demanded my paycheck. How they treated Haley like royalty while expecting me to sacrifice everything. I didn't sugarcoat it. And by the time I finished, there was a silence on the other end of the line that made my heart race. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed. It wasn't just disappointment. It was fury held tightly in check. "Your father doesn't know what family means," he said quietly. "But I do. Leave this to me." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. But over the next few weeks, something started to shift. Whispers in the family, tension at gatherings, phone calls my parents refused to explain. And then, a letter arrived at my door. It wasn't from my parents. It was from my grandfather. When that letter from my grandfather arrived, I didn't open it right away. I just stared at the envelope sitting on my kitchen table, my name written in his neat, deliberate handwriting. It had that old, formal feel, not something sent in haste, but something meant. I finally tore it open that night after work, my hand still trembling from nerves. Inside was a single folded letter and a cashier's check. The check was for $5,000. The letter read, "Tyler, I don't want you struggling because of your father's mistakes. Consider this a small cushion while I handle things my way. Don't confront them. Don't tell them about this. Just focus on yourself for now. You've earned that right." Grandpa. I sat there for a long time, just rereading the words. There was something unsettling about how calmly he'd written, "I'll handle things my way." He wasn't a man who made idle promises. When he said he'd take care of something, it usually meant someone was going to regret crossing him. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with the money. I tucked it into my desk drawer, told myself I'd save it. But over the next few days, I started to notice how the atmosphere around my family was shifting, especially toward me. My dad started calling less, which should have been a relief. But when he did call, his tone was clipped, defensive. My mom sounded nervous, like she was tiptoeing around something. Haley, on the other hand, was just as entitled as ever. One night, she texted me out of nowhere. "You've really disappointed Dad. He said you're turning into one of those people, selfish, greedy. I can't believe you'd let your niece go without what she needs." I almost laughed. Her niece was wearing designer baby clothes, while I was calculating how to stretch my paycheck until the next one. Still, I didn't reply. I didn't have the energy for her dramatics. 2 weeks later, my dad called and asked me to come by the house for dinner. His tone was unnervingly polite. I should have known something was off right then. But I went, partly because I missed my mom and partly because I wanted to see what was going on behind the scenes. When I arrived, Haley was already there, sitting at the table with the baby in a high chair. My mom looked tense, moving around the kitchen like she was trying to hold everything together. My dad sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, watching me. The moment I sat down, he started. "So," he said, his voice low but sharp, "you've been talking to my father." I froze. "What?" He leaned forward. "Don't play dumb. He called me last week, lecturing me about family values and how I'm treating you. You went running to him, didn't you?" "I didn't run to him," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "He called me. He asked what was going on, so I told him." My dad slammed his hand on the table, making the baby startle and cry. "You had no right. What happens in this family stays in this family. You made me look like a fool to my own father." Mom tried to intervene. "Honey, please." But he waved her off. His face was red, and I could feel his anger radiating across the table. Haley smirked from her seat. "Well, maybe if you weren't being selfish, Grandpa wouldn't have had to get involved," she said. "You could have just kept helping instead of making this a big deal." That was the first time I snapped. "Helping? Haley, I was paying your bills. I was covering your groceries while you sat around doing nothing." She gasped, offended, like I'd just cursed at her. "I'm raising a baby. That's not nothing." "Yeah, and plenty of single mothers do that without draining their brother dry." My dad slammed his fist again. "Enough. You will not disrespect your sister in this house." I stood up slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. "No, I think I've disrespected myself long enough." For a long moment, no one said anything. Then my dad's voice dropped to something colder. "You're not part of this family anymore if you can't understand loyalty." I left without saying another word. That night, I got a call from my mom. Her voice was trembling. "Tyler, your father didn't mean it. He's just upset. Please don't let this drive you away." I wanted to believe her, but I could hear him shouting in the background, something about ungrateful kids and disrespect. That told me everything I needed to know. The next few weeks were tense. I tried focusing on work, tried pretending none of it bothered me, but it did. The silence from them was heavy. Until one day, I checked my bank account and saw something that made my stomach drop. A withdrawal. $1,200 gone. I stared at the transaction details. It was from a joint account I'd opened years ago with my mom, back when I was in college and needed her co-signature for rent. I'd completely forgotten it still existed. Apparently, they hadn't. I called her immediately. "Mom, did you take money from my account?" She went quiet. Then, softly, "Your father needed it for Haley's expenses. We thought you wouldn't mind." "You thought I wouldn't mind?" I said, my voice breaking. "That's my savings. You had no right." She started crying, whispering apologies, but I couldn't even listen. My hands were shaking so bad I had to sit down. That was my breaking point. Not just the money, but the betrayal. The realization that they truly didn't see me as a person anymore, just a source of income. I spent that night drafting an email to the bank to close the account and remove their access. Then, for good measure, I moved all my funds to a new bank entirely. I didn't tell them. I didn't even tell my mom. I just cut it off quietly, the same way I'd been cutting pieces of them out of my life for months. But things didn't stay quiet for long. A few days later, Haley showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing there with the baby in a stroller, her expression tight and indignant. "Really classy move," she said, crossing her arms. "Cutting Mom and Dad off. You made Mom cry, you know." I sighed. "Haley, I'm not doing this anymore." "You owe them, Tyler," she snapped. "They supported you for years. You think you'd be where you are without them? You wouldn't even have that job. I got that job on my own." She laughed, that same fake, condescending laugh that had always gotten under my skin. "Sure you did. You think Grandpa would be proud of this? You think you can just walk away from family?" That last part made me pause. "What does Grandpa have to do with this?" She smirked. "Oh, he knows. Dad told him everything." He said Grandpa's furious, says he's cutting you out of his will. My heart sank. I didn't even care about the money, but the idea that my grandfather, the one person who had believed me, had turned against me hurt more than I wanted to admit. She must have seen it on my face, because her tone softened, almost pitying. You should just apologize. Dad said he might let it go if you send them something. A peace offering. I closed the door in her face. That night, I sat in the dark of my living room, phone in my hand, staring at my grandfather's number. I wanted to call him, to ask if it was true, but something told me to wait. The next morning, my question was answered, not by a phone call, but by another letter. This one wasn't handwritten. It was typed, crisp, and direct. It was from my grandfather's lawyer. It said he wanted to meet with me privately. At first, I thought it was a trap. Maybe my dad was behind it. But when I arrived at the lawyer's office, my grandfather was there in person, sitting in the corner, his cane resting beside him. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp. "Sit down, Tyler," he said. I did. He didn't waste time. "Your father told me his version," he said. Then I heard Haley's. But something didn't add up. So I did some checking of my own. He leaned forward and placed a folder on the desk. Bank statements. Credit records. Do you know what I found? I shook my head slowly. Your father has been transferring money from your old joint account for months. Thousands of dollars. And not just to Haley. Some of it went to personal expenses, his car payments, restaurant bills, even a vacation fund. My stomach twisted. He what? Grandpa nodded grimly. He used you, Tyler, and then lied to everyone to cover it up. I couldn't even speak. All that anger I'd been holding back for years, it just turned cold. Then my grandfather said something that made my chest tighten. I gave him one chance to explain himself. He lied to my face. So now, I'm done with him. He stood up slowly, gripping his cane, and looked at me with that quiet fire in his eyes. I want you to know, Tyler, I'm not going to let this go. Your father thinks he can manipulate people forever, but I'm about to show him that actions have consequences. He placed his hand on my shoulder, firm and deliberate. I'm changing everything. I didn't know what that meant yet. But deep down, I could feel it. Something huge was coming. Something that would tear our family apart once and for all. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of that. After that meeting with my grandfather, I went home in a daze. The idea that my father had been siphoning money from me for months, all while pretending to be the righteous, demanding parent, felt like a punch I couldn't recover from. I sat on my couch for hours, staring at the floor, trying to process everything. The betrayal wasn't just about the money. It was about the years of manipulation, the way they'd always treated me like I owed them my life. That realization made my chest ache. For a moment, I felt smaller than I'd ever felt before, like every decision I'd ever made had been under a microscope, every act of kindness twisted into proof of my indebtedness. I'd hit rock bottom, emotionally and mentally. I didn't want to answer my phone, didn't want to check my emails, didn't even want to leave my apartment. The baby photos Haley sent didn't feel innocent anymore. They were taunts, reminders of how I was supposed to sacrifice for a family that only saw me as a tool. And for the first time in years, I let myself cry. Not because I was weak, but because I had been holding all of it in for so long that it threatened to swallow me whole. The following weeks were a haze. I quit going out, my sleep became sporadic, and the office felt like a prison even though I liked my work. I started questioning myself. Was I overreacting? Was I really being selfish, as Haley said? Then I remembered my grandfather's words. Your father used you. He lied. He manipulated. And that memory sparked something else, a spark I hadn't felt in a long time. Anger. Not blind anger, but sharp, precise anger that made me sit up straighter. I realized I had two choices: stay crushed under their weight, or quietly rebuild my life on my terms. The answer was obvious. I started small. I made a strict budget for myself, tracking every penny. I set up a separate account where no one, not my parents, not Haley, could touch my money. I stopped responding to texts from my dad and sister unless it was absolutely necessary, and I started making my apartment feel like my sanctuary again. Clean, organized, and mine. It might not have seemed like much to anyone else, but to me, it was a small declaration of independence. Next, I focused on work. I poured myself into projects, taking on additional responsibilities that went beyond my job description. My boss noticed. One afternoon, she called me into her office. Tyler, I've been impressed with your work lately. We're considering you for a lead position in the next quarter. I felt a mix of pride and disbelief. All those years of struggling, being overlooked, being treated like I was expendable, it was finally paying off. I accepted the challenge, diving into the new role with everything I had. I realized that for the first time, I was building a life that wasn't dictated by anyone else. But while I was quietly climbing, the family drama didn't stop. Haley had somehow learned about the money my grandfather had sent me, though she didn't know it came with strings attached, and her entitlement spiraled. She started texting constantly, demanding contributions for clothes, toys, and emergency expenses that she never bothered to define. When I didn't respond immediately, she resorted to passive-aggressive messages about how I was abandoning her and how family doesn't act this way. It hurt, but I learned to keep my distance. I blocked her on social media, ignored her calls, and let my grandfather handle any family-related fallout. That was a turning point for me. I realized that I didn't have to justify myself to anyone who had consistently tried to manipulate me. My self-worth didn't come from their approval, it came from me. Slowly, life started to feel lighter. I started saving aggressively, investing in a small portfolio I'd researched endlessly. I even signed up for a weekend coding class, something I'd always wanted to do, and in my free time, I began developing a side business. It was small at first, selling organizational tools and accounting templates online, but I loved it. For the first time, I felt genuinely proud of something I'd built entirely by myself. Work, savings, side projects, it all added up. I began noticing a quiet confidence growing inside me, one that had nothing to do with my parents' approval or Haley's drama. I was becoming my own person, and it felt incredible. But even as I was building this new life, the remnants of the old family tension lingered. One Saturday, I got a text from my mom. "We need to talk. It's about Grandpa. Please come over." My stomach dropped. Grandpa had always been my ally, the one family member I trusted completely. Why would she call me about him? I hesitated but agreed, figuring it might be nothing, or at least a chance to hear him out directly. When I arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Mom opened the door, her expression unreadable. "He wants to see you," she said, leading me into the study. My grandfather was there, seated behind his massive desk. But he wasn't smiling. Not that he ever smiled much, but there was a tension in the room, a weight that made me uneasy. "Sit, Tyler," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent I hadn't heard before. "I've been monitoring the situation closely." I sat, trying to read him. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Your father and Haley have made a few mistakes lately. Mistakes that need to be addressed properly." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He opened a folder on his desk, pushing it toward me. Inside were financial records, receipts, and bank statements. Dozens of pages showing months of misappropriated money, hidden expenses, and even questionable loans that my dad had taken out in my name without telling me. "Do you see this?" he asked. "Your father has been lying not just to you, but to the entire family. And Haley, well, she's been complicit, whether intentionally or not." I flipped through the papers, my jaw tightening with every page. This wasn't just betrayal. It was theft, manipulation, and deception woven together over years. Grandpa leaned forward. "I gave your father the benefit of the doubt. I thought perhaps he was struggling. But he's been using you." And when I confronted him, he lied. That's when I decided it was time for action. "What kind of action?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to rebuild your life fully independent from them," he said. "I'll provide support where necessary, but this isn't about money anymore. It's about restoring the balance, showing them that loyalty and respect are earned, not demanded." Over the next few weeks, I began to notice subtle changes. My father started calling less frequently, and when he did, it was always in short, clipped sentences. Haley tried messaging me multiple times, but I didn't respond. Even my mom seemed uncertain, like she was tiptoeing around me. I was no longer the scared, obedient son. I was Tyler, the independent adult who wasn't afraid to draw boundaries. During this time, my side business started growing. Orders came in steadily, and soon I hired a small part-time assistant to help with logistics. Work at the accounting firm was rewarding, and the promotion I'd received a few months earlier gave me a sense of authority and accomplishment I'd never known. I also reconnected with old friends I'd drifted away from because of family obligations. Dinner with them became a routine, Sometimes quiet nights of talking about work, other times spontaneous weekends away. For the first time, I realized that I could enjoy life without feeling guilty for it. Then came the first hint that my grandfather's influence was making waves in the family. My dad called me one evening, his voice low and tight. "Tyler, we need to talk." I hesitated, but didn't answer. The next day, I received a small package at my apartment. Inside was a note from Grandpa. "They're testing the waters. Don't engage. Wait for my signal." It was clear that he wasn't just protecting me. He was orchestrating something. Something that would shake the foundation of our family to its core. I sat back in my chair, looking around my apartment, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation. For the first time, I realized that while I'd been rebuilding quietly, patiently, my grandfather had been setting the stage for the ultimate reckoning. And I was ready. After weeks of quiet rebuilding, I finally started seeing the full picture. My grandfather had been dropping subtle hints, guiding me without interfering directly, letting me learn how to handle my family's manipulations on my own. He wasn't just protecting me. He was teaching me how to prepare, how to gather leverage, and how to hit when the time was right. That realization lit a fire in me I hadn't felt since discovering the full extent of my father's betrayal. For the first time, I understood that revenge wasn't about screaming, confronting, or letting emotions run wild. It was about control, patience, and precision. I began mapping out every aspect of the situation. I started with the finances. Thanks to my grandfather's intervention, I had copies of all the bank statements, credit reports, and loan documents that my father had manipulated over the years. I spent nights combing through them, highlighting discrepancies, fraudulent withdrawals, and expenses that were clearly unrelated to Haley or the household. Every little detail became ammunition, a piece of the puzzle I could use when the time came. I discovered credit cards in my name I didn't know existed, late fees my father had paid from other accounts to cover his tracks, and even a few suspicious loans he'd taken out at my credit limit, pretending they were for Haley's expenses. It was astonishing how much he'd relied on my obedience, assuming I'd never notice. Next, I focused on Haley. I knew she'd been complicit, whether deliberately or because she had been conditioned to demand and take. I started quietly documenting her spending, the way she presented needs as emergencies, and how she leveraged my father's authority to pressure me. Every designer baby outfit, every unplanned trip to the store, every text she sent me demanding contributions, I saved it. I started compiling a digital folder, receipts, screenshots, bank statements, and even some photos showing the contrast between the luxurious life she claimed to struggle with and the reality of her living conditions. Meanwhile, I carefully rebuilt bridges with friends and colleagues who had influence or expertise that could help me. There was Clara, a coworker at the firm who handled compliance and internal audits. She had an eye for inconsistencies and a quiet, calculating mind. I shared the situation with her, under the pretense that I needed advice on unusual financial discrepancies. Without prying too much, she offered strategies to document everything so it could hold up if legal action became necessary. I also reached out to two of my oldest friends, Jordan and May, who were business savvy and quick thinking. I explained, in broad strokes, what my family had been doing to me and how I wanted to make sure I wasn't caught off guard again. They didn't ask for proof. They'd seen me get walked over by my family for years, and they knew my temperament. They agreed to help me brainstorm ways to turn the tables strategically, making sure any action I took wouldn't backfire. The next step was psychological. I studied my family's patterns, how they reacted to guilt, how they manipulated situations to get what they wanted, and how they justified their actions. I began imagining scenarios in which I could play them at their own game. Haley, for example, always flaunted the support she received from me and my grandfather without realizing that flaunting it could work against her. My father, meanwhile, had a predictable ego. He needed to appear in control, to dominate conversations, and to look morally superior. These were weaknesses I could exploit. One evening, as I sat in my apartment surrounded by spreadsheets, folders, and notes, I realized the most powerful tool I had wasn't the money or the evidence alone. It was information. I had amassed knowledge about every lie, every misappropriation, every manipulation, and I could control when and how it surfaced. That was when the plan started to crystallize. I wouldn't confront them directly. I wouldn't yell or accuse. I would wait. and I would act only when the timing guaranteed maximum impact. I also began testing the waters subtly. I'd send Haley small sums of money that were intentionally short or late, watching how she reacted. Every complaint, every whiny text, every panicked call I ignored became data. I cataloged it. My father started noticing the resistance and tried to confront me a few times, but I remained calm, composed, and noncommittal. I didn't give them anything to pin down emotionally. Instead, I observed. I analyzed. I recorded. One night, I received another call from my grandfather. His voice was calm, but the undercurrent of authority was unmistakable. "Tyler, it's time you understand that a trap only works if the bait is irresistible. Your father and Haley are greedy, predictable. They'll take the bait if they think it benefits them." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "I understand." "Good. But remember," he continued, "this isn't just about exposing them. It's about restoring balance. They've spent years thinking they could walk over you. This ends quietly, efficiently, and permanently. You don't get angry. You don't rush. You wait for the perfect moment." Over the next week, I started manipulating circumstances subtly. I made a point of making my work life and personal finances look less stable than they really were, letting them think I was still vulnerable and under their control. I let Haley believe I was struggling to keep up with contributions, and I allowed my father to feel smug, confident that he still held the upper hand. Every interaction was carefully calculated. A small smile here, a neutral tone there, an appearance of compliance that concealed the full extent of my awareness. At the same time, I was fortifying my own resources. I had saved aggressively, invested wisely, and even secured a small line of credit to use if needed. I'd hired May to audit my side business, ensuring all revenue streams were above board, creating a paper trail that could stand up legally. I had legal counsel ready in case anything escalated, and I knew exactly how to present evidence without implicating myself in any wrongdoing. Every detail was planned, every contingency considered. I also began observing family gatherings more closely. At dinner, I noticed patterns I hadn't before. The way my father controlled conversations, the way Haley positioned herself to draw sympathy, and the way my mother tried to mediate without asserting authority. I started identifying allies I could influence. My uncle, who had always been quietly skeptical of my father's decisions, seemed like someone who could be swayed if I presented him with the right information. Even a few distant cousins who were aware of Haley's excessive lifestyle could be helpful in amplifying the narrative when the time came. Then came the perfect opportunity. Haley had a baby shower planned, and my parents insisted I attend. They framed it as a family celebration, but I knew better. They wanted to flaunt my contributions and guilt-trip me into giving more money on the spot. I decided to go, but only because it would be the perfect stage to set my plan into motion. In the days leading up to the shower, I made subtle moves. I accidentally left some financial documents where Haley could see them, hinting at expenses she hadn't accounted for. I made sure my phone was full of screenshots of her complaints and my father's manipulations, so I could reference them later if needed. I even spoke with Clara at work about an angle for verifying transactions quietly during the event. She suggested I subtly gather confirmation of fraudulent transfers while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. By the time the day of the shower arrived, I was calm, collected, and fully prepared. I wasn't the scared, obedient son anymore. I wasn't the quiet provider they could manipulate at will. I was a man who had been underestimated, dismissed, and betrayed. And now, I had the tools, the allies, and the knowledge to turn the tables. I walked into the house that morning, dressed professionally, carrying nothing but a small folder I'd prepared with critical information. The living room was full of family and friends, all laughing, chatting, and enjoying themselves. Haley rushed to greet me, baby in arms, wearing that same smug smile that used to make me grind my teeth. My father was nearby, surveying the room like a king presiding over his kingdom. I smiled politely, said hello, and took a seat near my grandfather, who gave me a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that the next moves were mine to make. As the party went on, I observed, waited, and calculated. Every laugh, every boast, every mention of money or contribution became another piece of data. I could see the cracks forming already. Haley's frustration at my calm demeanor, my father's subtle irritation at my refusal to engage in his usual guilt-tripping. My mother hovered nervously, clearly sensing the tension but unsure how to intervene. It was perfect. Every variable was accounted for, every reaction predicted. I wasn't rushing anything. I was letting the pieces fall exactly where they needed to. And I knew, deep down, that when the time came, the fall would be spectacular. The kind of fall that left no room for excuses, denials, or manipulations. The day of the baby shower arrived like any other, the house buzzing with people, laughter, and the faint scent of flowers my mother had insisted on arranging. I walked in carrying only my folder and a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in years. Haley rushed over immediately, cooing over her baby, and my father trailed behind, trying to appear casual, like he hadn't been seething for weeks over my resistance. My mother hovered near the kitchen, nervously wiping her hands on a towel, clearly aware that tension was simmering just beneath the surface. I took a seat near my grandfather, who gave me a subtle nod, the kind that told me he trusted the plan I had set into motion. It wasn't about dramatic confrontations or shouting matches. It was about precision, about showing them that all their manipulation and greed could no longer control me. I opened my folder, pulling out printed copies of the bank statements, the screenshots, the receipts, and the detailed tracking of every questionable expense my father had made in my name. I had even included a concise summary showing the discrepancy between what he claimed I owed and what he had actually taken. Haley noticed immediately, peeking over my shoulder. "What's that?" she asked, her tone curious but cautious. I smiled politely. "Just some notes I've been keeping, documenting finances and contributions. I thought it might be useful to review before the shower." She laughed nervously. "You've really been keeping track of all that?" I nodded, calm. "Yes. I thought it was important to be thorough." At that moment, my father moved closer, frowning at the folder. "Tyler, what is that? Are you implying something?" I leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I'm just presenting the facts. I've been meticulous. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every expense, it's all documented." A hush fell over the room. Some of the relatives began glancing at each other, sensing the tension, though they didn't know the full story. My grandfather rose from his chair, walking over slowly. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Let's review this together," he said, his tone calm but commanding. I spread the documents across the table, showing them chronologically, with notes highlighting how my father had used funds meant for household support and my sister's baby to cover personal expenses, vacations, and even gambling-related debts. Haley's face turned pale as I pointed out purchases she had insisted were necessities for the baby that were, in reality, extravagant or unnecessary. "Wait," Haley stammered. I didn't know." "You didn't know?" I said evenly. "Or you just didn't care?" "Because the pattern is clear. Every time there was money available, it was used to cover things that had nothing to do with the baby. And when I raised concerns, I was told I was selfish or ungrateful." My father's face reddened, but he tried to maintain control. This is exaggerated. You're twisting things." I stayed calm, turning to my grandfather. "Grandpa, would you like to explain what you found when you reviewed Dad's accounts?" He stepped forward, voice steady and authoritative. I didn't want to believe it at first. I hoped there had been some misunderstanding. But the truth is undeniable. Tyler's father has been taking money from him for months under false pretenses. And Haley has been complicit, benefiting from this misappropriation. The room went silent. My father opened his mouth to argue, but my grandfather cut him off. "Not a word. I have copies of every transaction, every statement, and a legal review confirming all discrepancies. I have already begun the process of correcting the financial damage and ensuring Tyler retains control over his own finances." Haley's expression shifted from shock to guilt to fear. "Grandpa, please, I didn't." "You did participate," my grandfather said, calm but stern. "Whether knowingly or out of ignorance, you accepted benefits under false pretenses. That stops now." I stayed quiet, letting the tension build. My father was fumbling for words, his ego no longer protecting him. "Tyler, this is a betrayal," he spat. I shook my head, my voice steady. "No, you betrayed me first, every year, every expectation, every manipulation. I just waited until I had the tools to expose it calmly, efficiently, and without letting emotions dictate the outcome." The relatives who had been gathered for the shower were now fully aware something serious was happening. A few whispered, exchanging glances as my grandfather methodically explained the findings. Some of my dad's friends and family members began to murmur about how long Tyler had been patient, how meticulous and composed he had been despite years of manipulation. Then came the final blow. I had enlisted Clara and May to gather independent verification of the financial discrepancies. Clara quietly presented a detailed audit showing every irregularity, all traced back to my father's mismanagement and deceptive transfers. May displayed a timeline linking transactions to lavish purchases, highlighting expenses that were falsely justified as necessary for Haley's baby. Haley's face crumpled, her smug confidence replaced by panic. "Tyler, I didn't know it was this bad," she said, voice trembling. "You did know," I said quietly. "You just didn't care because it benefited you." My father tried to regain control, but every relative in the room had seen the evidence. His authority had crumbled. He stammered, defensive, pleading for explanations that no one accepted anymore. My mother, overwhelmed by guilt and shame, couldn't even look at me. She quietly retreated to the kitchen, silently acknowledging that the scales had shifted permanently. My grandfather turned to me, his voice firm. "Tyler, you've handled this perfectly. Calm, patient, meticulous. You've exposed the truth without losing your composure or moral high ground. This is how you take back control." I nodded, feeling a surge of satisfaction I had never experienced before. Every year of obedience, every dollar taken from me, every manipulation, it had all led to this moment. The fallout was immediate. My father was confronted by the relatives and friends present, forced to apologize publicly for his actions, and agree to repay misappropriated funds. Haley was confronted as well, and although she tried to rationalize her behavior, it was clear to everyone that she had enabled the deception. My mother, quietly remorseful, admitted her failures in front of everyone, and although there was tension, it was grounded in accountability rather than manipulation. By the end of the gathering, I realized something profound. This wasn't just revenge. It was restoration. I hadn't needed to yell, fight, or manipulate in turn. I had used patience, strategy, and intelligence to correct the balance that had been skewed for years. I had taken back what was mine, not just the finances, but my dignity, my autonomy, and my self-respect. Weeks later, life returned to a new normal. My father had retreated into his own guilt. My sister had become more cautious and less entitled, and my mother began to see me as an equal rather than a perpetual subordinate. I continued to grow my side business, advanced at work, and strengthened relationships with friends and allies who had supported me quietly throughout the ordeal. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that I was not powerless. I had learned that control and respect are not given. They are earned, defended, and, when necessary, reclaimed. Sitting in my apartment one evening, reviewing the latest orders for my business, I thought back to all the moments of doubt and despair, the nights I had cried alone, the pangs of guilt my father tried to force on me, the manipulation I had endured. And I smiled, quietly, without arrogance, without malice. Because finally, after years of being underestimated and dismissed, I had taken everything they thought they could control from me, and I had done it calmly, methodically, and perfectly. And for the first time, I knew I would never let anyone take that power from me again. It was over. The scales were balanced, and I was free.